During the 70s, the Burlington Northern became a familiar face in a large part of the U.S., operating nearly 29,000 miles of track before it became today's BNSF system. The BN began on March 2, 1970, spreading its Cascade green and white paint over the principal lines of the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, among others. A whole generation of rail fans grew up along with the BN, and they will miss its old look and how it competed with its rivals in the West. The years rolled on during this quarter century of successful operation, helping to bring the railroad industry out of a decline and into a modernized mode of transportation. The public had gained the perception that railroads were archaic and unable to compete in the modern world. But the BN and others made the adaptation and proved them wrong by any standard. The railroad industry was America's first great industry, and it became revitalized in some large measure by the success of the BN merger. To understand the great significance of the Burlington Northern merger in 1970, we'd like to show you some of the other players in the industry that the BN and its predecessors competed and worked with. The 1960s started with a round of railroad mergers. Examples of roads funneling into the nation's rail hub in Chicago include the 1960 combining of the Erie and the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western into the Erie-Lackawanna. The Norfolk and Western was on a roll, taking in several smaller roads, and the Wabash and the Nickel Plate roads around 1964. Much of the merger activity then was from having too many duplicate roads in the overbuilt East and also the Midwest. There was a time in our history when many roads were built with no other chance of success beyond attracting investors' money. As a result, many would fall in and out of numerous bankruptcies and reorganizations during the 20th century. The Chesapeake and Ohio gradually took control over the line that dated from the beginning of it all, the Baltimore and Ohio. This merger was the beginning of the modern CSX system. The Chicago Great Western was merged into the Chicago and Northwestern in 1968, but most of that trackage would be deemed redundant or unproductive and abandoned later on. The weakening health of the once mighty Pennsy and the New York Central created the combined Penn Central system by 1968. This merger of two incompatible old rivals was doomed to fail in a 1970 bankruptcy that shook the railroad industry. The Penn Central failure cast a large shadow over not only the industry, but also any new large mergers. Congress would reorganize the mess into Conrail by 1976, which earned its way back to a respectable operation over time. The Burlington Northern was formed by a merger approved by the ICC in 1970 from 3 principal and 3 secondary railroads. As time went on, other major lines would fall into the BN camp. The merger had its beginnings in 1956 from planning by the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. Other elements of the merger were all in one way or another owned and controlled by the GN or the NP. The original BN formed a 23,000-mile system from Chicago to Canada, the Upper Great Lakes, and out to the Pacific Northwest with an additional line reaching down to the Gulf through Texas. The Great Northern and the Northern Pacific were the principal lines, and between them they owned the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or CB&Q. The CB&Q was actually the largest of the 3 in track miles. The CB&Q owned the Colorado and Southern and the Fort Worth and Denver that provided the connections down to the Gulf through Texas. The BN itself is now wrapped into another merger of 1995, forming the Burlington Northern Santa Fe system. Many rail fans grew into the hobby since 1970, and the quarter century of the old BN will be missed by them. We created this video to look at the original 1970 merger and review some of the achievements of the Northern Pacific, Great Northern, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. The Northern Pacific was conceived during the American Civil War to add a second transcontinental line to the Pacific. The charter, signed in 1864 by President Lincoln, was to build from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound over a course much like that followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition, dating from 1806. Construction started in 1870 and had many problems with financing, punctuated by the country's financial panic of 1873. The line was nominally completed by 1883, with all the promotion possible, even though much work remained to finish tunnels and eliminate all the temporary track work and maze of switchbacks in the mountains. The Northern Pacific's bankruptcy of 1893 intertwined with the country's financial panic of 1893, and it weakened the Northern Pacific. While in receivership, the NP had famous J.P. Morgan as a financial agent. James Hill of the Great Northern became interested in the Northern Pacific, and Hill had a way to buy into the NP at a bargain price. By the turn of the century, the country's two most dynamic railroad men, James Hill and E.H. Harriman, would enter into a fight over control of the NP. Their heavy purchases of stock drove up the value to extraordinary prices per share. Despite their repeated attempts to negotiate, the ongoing fight attracted the attention of the government. Teddy Roosevelt was sworn in as president by 1901 after McKinley's assassination, and his reformist policies would have an effect on the fortunes of the two railroad rivals. After its 1893 bankruptcy, Harriman gained control over the Union Pacific, and by 1901 he had rebuilt it into a formidable railroad. Harriman also controlled the Southern Pacific by 1901, adding to the threat of controlling the West. James Hill and his ally J.P. Morgan formed the Northern Securities Company as a holding company for the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. The U.S. Supreme Court broke up the Northern Securities Company by 1904. James Hill would continue to operate the two railroads, but as separate companies. Within a year, the two roads created the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway to stop Harriman's spreading Southern Pacific in the Oregon market. The Harriman Empire would lose the SP by Supreme Court order by 1913, but the Northern Pacific had been secured by James Hill to become one of the key elements in his Empire of the North. The NP would be on good footing from then on and improve and grow into a 6,700-mile system. A progression of steam power ultimately brought the 484 Northern class and the giant Yellowstones capable of handling tonnage in mountainous territories. Both Hill and Harriman represented a new breed in railroading. They vastly improved the standards of everything they touched. They believed in putting earnings right back into the railroad and using first-class material that was made to last. Many other roads, taking outside investment money, were forced to bleed their businesses to satisfy returns to their investors. James Hill was his own source of investment money, and he was a patient man. James Hill was also involved with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway at one time, and he considered a Canadian route for his own empire. Born as a Canadian, Hill worked equally well on both sides of the border. This Canadian Rockies track could have been part of the empire, but for a few other opportunities that returned his focus to the U.S. side of the border. James Jerome Hill was born in 1838. He had an early vision of trading with the Orient by sea. In his early years, he had to settle for working as a clerk on a riverboat line in Minnesota, and he learned about setting freight and passenger rates well. After the Civil War, he worked in a similar capacity for the small St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. The panic of 1873 severely weakened the line, and Hill used his own savings and money from a few partners, and they bought the line for a very low price. This was the seed line of his Great Northern Railway that he built to the Pacific. He earned the reputation as the Empire Builder, and the beautiful streamliner carried the same name to the Amtrak era. Between the Great Northern and his Northern Pacific, the Northwest was built up from wilderness to productive farming and businesses providing natural resources. The access to the Pacific Ocean at Seattle and Portland gave the Hill lines the access to the Orient trade with Japan that had fascinated Hill from his youthful days. That would eventually blossom with the addition of one more key line that Hill would add to his empire. In the earliest days of railroads, their purpose was largely to serve water vessels by extending the reach of seaports, rivers, and canals. Over the decades, railroads opened up new territories in the vast middle of the country. As time goes on, the railroads are working the sidings and branch lines less and less as they concentrate on serving water vessels more and more by moving seagoing containers between east and west ports. The other core business is moving vast amounts of bulk commodities such as coal and grain, often to seaports for export. One more great line that served the Hill lines was the CB&Q. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or the Q, dated from a modest predecessor beginning in 1849. The line grew to connect with both the GN and the NP in the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. The Q's lines extended to Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, and other points to the northwest. E.H. Harriman wanted the Q for his own, to connect his Omaha, Nebraska-based Union Pacific line into Chicago. James Hill beat him to the punch on this one too. The Q was a perfect addition to Hill's plans. His GN and NP moved most of their loads to the east in the form of produce and lumber. Many cars returned to the west empty. The addition of the CB&Q gave vital connections into Chicago from St. Paul and added to loads heading west. The Q's access into their territory brought manufactured goods, cotton, textiles, and grain that could be shipped for export from Seattle. By 1901, the Northern Pacific and Great Northern jointly purchased the CB&Q. The Q had a good financial history, but it would nevertheless benefit from being in the Hill camp. At the same time, the Hill lines could grow with the Q's connections and online freight loadings. Turning the clock back to the building of the Panama Canal will reveal an interesting story that is deeply intertwined with railroad lore. While Hill and Harriman's activities were under the scrutiny of President Teddy Roosevelt's administration, the Panama Canal was being built. The French had failed years earlier, leaving broken and rusting machinery and unfinished work being reclaimed by the jungle. But now the determination of Roosevelt, more modern power tools, and the utility of the railroad would make it work this time. Roosevelt was keen about the value of sea power, and he remembered how warships during the Spanish-American War were always on the wrong ocean to respond to events. The canal would end the days of ships running the entire course around the tip of South America to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. The building of a canal would seriously cut into shipping by rail, especially for goods shipped from the east to Asia. After 9 years of heavy work, the canal's opening seemed like a dark day for the railroads, but the canal did effectively showcase American abilities and its willingness to project power with shipping and a more flexible navy. This would help grow the country to a larger economic size, and eventually the railroads would also benefit. The scramble was on, and an army of men and machines raced to build the canal while Teddy Roosevelt dealt with the politics of objections to its building at home. While weaker presidents would have minced time away, waiting for congressional approval for every detail, Teddy was the type to charge ahead, get the job underway, and apologize later. It was no surprise that men like Roosevelt, Harriman, and James Hill would have their clashes. They all had been cut from the same cloth of greatness. James Hill had already lost John Stevens to the canal building. Stevens was the original surveyor and civil engineer in the early days of much of Hill's Great Northern line. Stevens had another engineer in his canal building project, the young Ralph Budd. Budd, a brilliant graduate civil engineer, did a remarkable job in helping to build the canal's railroad across a dense mosquito-infested jungle. The Canal Railroad was essential to the project. It was successful and ahead of schedule in its construction. The canal was one of the world's greatest projects at the time, with massive movement of jungle, then earth. James Hill was impressed with Ralph Budd and he eventually hired him. Budd became president of Hill's Great Northern quickly after that. After a time improving the Great Northern, he moved on to the CB&Q, where he really flourished. Budd entered the Q at its worst financial state. In 1932, in the throes of the Great Depression, he successfully brought the company back without government loans and the reorganization and intervention that would have come with it. With the Dust Bowl economy in effect, he had to improve the railroad with less agricultural traffic to haul and earn revenues from. Passenger travel was also down, and cost exceeded revenues, making it look like a loser. Budd was an early advocate of diesel power, and it was in the worst part of the Depression when he envisioned a new way to operate passenger trains and bring the public back. He worked directly with Ed Budd, no known relation, of Budd Manufacturing Company to design the Pioneer Zephyr. The concept was to create a light, fast, economical train that could attract passengers back to the rails. The automobile had already started the decline of rail travel by the 30s. The 1934 Zephyr was intended to fire up the public with visions of clean, fast modern trains running routinely at 100+ miles per hour with safety. The name was taken from Zephyrus, the mythological Greek god of the west wind. The train's speed came from light but strong stainless steel structures using new patented welding techniques that didn't change the strength of the material in the welding process. The cars were permanently coupled and they shared trucks to reduce friction and total weight. Every single item in this train was designed specifically for speed, strength, and lightweight. The train was showcased in a May 1934 record-breaking run, taking only 14 hours between Denver and Chicago. Many sections found the train running well above 100 miles an hour, and nothing else was allowed on the track. Switches were reportedly bolted or welded to the straight-ahead position to preclude any mishap. The impact on the press and the general public was enormous, and people talked about the train and flocked to the train. The positive impact paid off on Ralph Budd's calculated gamble, and the CB&Q's luck began to turn positive from that point on. In June 1934, the train was at the opening ceremony of the new Moffett line on the Rio Grande in Colorado. Now, Rio Grande trains could go from Denver to Salt Lake City in a direct route, bypassing Pueblo and the grueling Tennessee Pass. Some years later, this would benefit the California Zephyr on the Rio Grande's section. On westward to the Western Pacific on its tour, and stops along the way gave California passengers a glimpse of their future in 16 more years. This 1934 Zephyr was America's first diesel-powered streamlined train, and it was assigned to the Kansas City to Omaha run until retired. Eventually, a fleet of Zephyrs was built with improved power and more cars and amenities. The Twin Cities Zephyr was one of the best known. This type of equipment was used into the 60s, and it was unique to the CB&Q. The half-locomotive, half-mail baggage car with its front power truck was built for speed and not much pulling power. The 660 original horsepower machine is notable in that it truly was the first diesel-powered streamliner. The Q also ran more conventional trains for heavy traffic and longer distance trains. They also forwarded the NP and GN's trains from the Twin Cities to Chicago. These locomotives were EMD's E-units with high-powered dual diesels. Many carried the same styling cues, with the red nose trim simulating the air intakes of the original Zephyr, and of course the simple, clean, unpainted stainless steel sides that have enduring elegance. The connection between Ralph Budd and Edward G. Budd of the Budd Corporation would continue with more trains, and the last Zephyr, the California Zephyr. But some plans would need to wait for the war looming over the country. Just as the Depression was wearing off, the country was suddenly involved in World War II when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Millions of Americans would learn of the event by radio, and once again the country's railroads would have to respond to a crush of troop and freight trains to support the war. Ralph Budd would help the country and its railroads by running the railroads as Federal Transportation Commissioner during World War II. The lesson of World War I was that during wartime the government's takeover of railroads could wreck even the strong ones when operated by government edicts, especially by men who didn't understand the business and its culture. President Franklin Roosevelt was persuaded to assign the overseeing of rail operations, if war broke out, to Ralph Budd. Budd started making the preparations even before the war started, and the railroads were ready when the moment came. These scenes provided by BNSF are from the Santa Fe, who back then, along with all the rest, pitched in to move goods and troops. This story repeated itself 1,000 times over each day until the war was over in 1945. In 50 more years, the Santa Fe itself would merge with the Burlington Northern to form the present-day BNSF system. The tonnage of war goods and raw materials could have overwhelmed the railroads if they didn't have a workable central plan from someone that thoroughly understood the art and science of railroading. Sure, there was lots of grumbling along the way, with new equipment on allocation, and many railroads were forced to accept locomotives that weren't their first choice for new power. In the large picture, the assignment paid off, and this time, most railroads were in good shape by war's end. Most had gained improved track, signals, and freight car fleets, and they met every demand in the process. By the war's end, most had money in the bank and plans to improve their service to a new and expanding peacetime economy. Ralph Budd returned to the CB&Q, and he had one more great achievement to participate in. The early scenes of the Pioneer Zephyr touring in Rio Grande and Western Pacific territories in the 30s gave a forecast of things to come. These views are what would become the standard for American scenic luxury travel. As we watch these scenes, it's important to remember that the schedule was arranged for sunlight in the scenic spots. Speed was secondary. During the war, and from an idea of General Motors' Cyrus Osborne, plans were sketched up for dome car trains to create a better scenic experience for passengers in the expanses of the West. The speediest part of the trip was on the CB&Q's fast main line, searing through the more ordinary scenery in darkness. The war's end reawakened the interest in the California Zephyr. It would take 4 more years before the train would operate over the CB&Q, the Rio Grande, and the Western Pacific, but it was the last word in Zephyr lore, and it would be worth the wait. we leave the scenic San Francisco Bay Area at 10 a.m. running down the old streets of Oakland and on the WP's tracks. The WP was a latecomer to the West, opened by 1910 and built mostly with money from the Gould Empire that owned the other partner of the California Zephyr, the Rio Grande. The Western Pacific had the Feather River Canyon route that was the main draw over the 928 miles to Salt Lake City in Utah. The Zephyr continued through the Nevada desert and western Utah during the night to arrive in Salt Lake City, Utah. The passengers in the tail-end dome observation car had the premium view, with a bar for Pullman passengers, and a quick climb up the staircase brought the famous dome car view of scenery. The Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad bridged the Zephyr to the CB&Q in Denver, Colorado. The Zephyr's menu included fresh brook trout, prime steak, and dishes associated with the regions the train traveled through. Dome seats were unreserved and unsold seats and provided for all passengers, coach and Pullman alike. In the summer, the Rio Grande's ride included sunlight all the way to Denver, Colorado. The California Zephyr left in darkness from Denver to run 1,034 miles to Chicago. This was the fastest part of the trip, and patrons would arrive in Chicago by 2 p.m. the next afternoon. To better show the experience of leaving Denver eastbound, we'll hop on a different train. These views of the CB&Q Denver Zephyr to Chicago at the dawn of Amtrak's era in 1971 give a few glimpses of late afternoon light. The Denver Zephyr was equipped much like the California Zephyr. The gleaming stainless steel cars and the silver E9s pulling up front were the influence of Ralph Budd of the CB&Q. The original California Zephyr's 3 railroad partners purchased the cars to support 6 10-car trains. The trains expanded to 13 cars with rising popularity. They all carried the California Zephyr name above the windows and reporting marks of each road at the car's ends. The 2,500-mile Zephyr run took 2.5 days total, and it was conceived from the start as a sightseeing experience. It could compete with air travel with this edge, and the 2.5 days could still compare favorably with auto travel. It offered more comfort than both, and passengers would arrive at either end of the system refreshed and in good spirits. This strategy worked until the 60s and the expanded interstate highway system, and with the arrival of jet air travel. The cost of operation began to exceed revenues, and the equipment was getting older. The increased maintenance strongly suggested purchasing all new equipment. All these factors were a burden that fell the hardest on the Western Pacific. The WP was the first to realize the inevitable, and the ICC allowed discontinuance in 1970. On March 22nd, the Ralph Budd-inspired California Zephyr tied up for the last time. The California Zephyr experience lasted 20 years. Racing down the CB&Q's hot main line toward Chicago shows a well-maintained and operated line. When the California Zephyr began operation on March 20th, 1949, Ralph Budd was retiring. Budd's Q was the strongest of the California Zephyr operators, and it had the most influence on the train's conception, design, and operation from the start. The Q had the better financial history and solid backing. This greatly helped to drive the project when it started after the war. Everyone would miss the California Zephyr, even the ones that never quite purchased tickets. Its passing was symbolic of some problems that were beginning to turn the rail industry upside down, and it would take several decades and even government changes and laws to sort out. The 77 California Zephyr cars built by the Budd Corporation were larger and more refined versions of the original Zephyrs. They shared the same strong 18-8 stainless steel construction. 18-8 is steel with 18% chromium and 8% nickel added for toughness and corrosion resistance. The Zephyr cars all had the word silver in the car names to remind the public that they were riding something special. The CB&Q Denver Zephyr continued all the way into the Amtrak era in 1971, with the CB&Q itself already immersed in the Burlington Northern merger of 1970. The clean window policy was a standard that all the James Hill lines promoted, and this car scrubber demonstrates the equipment. The railroad industry was changing again, and over the next 20 years there would be a lot of service changes, mergers, and even collapses. Let's look back to the 50s to see the railroads that would eventually form the Burlington Northern. The 50s brought an end to steam on all the Hill lines. The GN, NP, SP&S, and the CB&Q all scrapped their steam power for the greatly improved diesel. The payoff was in the form of a much smaller labor force, fuel bills, and better locomotive availability. Diesels had already made inroads, and now the facilities for steam could be removed. The Northern Pacific was reluctant to dump steam at first, and the informal plan was to end it all by 1960. After a number of diesels were received, many of the larger steam classes were stored in working order as a safety measure for an upturn in traffic that never came in time to extend their stay. Railroads all across North America scrapped steam locomotives by the tens of thousands. As good as these steam locomotives were, it would take the operating economy of the diesel to keep railroads competitive with trucking on the interstate. The larger classes of steam power were often retired as nearly new units, with years of potential operation left in them. In many cases, they were built during World War II and forced on the railroads to fill a gap that limited diesel production could not fill. Besides scrapping entire classes of steam locomotives, some were set aside in reserve in case of business surges that never came. These too were scrapped or given away to public parks for display. A select few were fortunate to be kept on as public relation tools for fan trips. The CB&Q's 484, number 5632, was active from 1958 to 1964. Eventually, it was scrapped. CB&Q's 282, number 4960, also performed rail fan duties from 1958 to 1966. The Q's new president ended steam operation for rail fan trips on the Q. The 4960 eventually went to the Grand Canyon Railway, where it received a total restoration for tourist operation that continues to this day from Williams, Arizona. The required pampering of steam locomotives was one factor in their demise in daily operations, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to operate them in rail fan excursions for the same reason. The specialized people needed to keep them up were retiring, and the facilities such as turntables, water tanks, and coaling towers were also being retired and torn out. Let's go back to see the inevitable phase-out of steam and the rise of the diesel locomotive that preserved the railroad industry. At one time, the railroads were the biggest industry in the country, but they were too labor-intensive to keep doing things the way they always had. The steam engine was the first target to bring these costs back into control and prepare the business for the modern era. Automobiles by 1941 were no longer comical novelties. They had become a threat to the passenger business on roads that also paralleled the tracks. The short branch line passenger mail train was the first target on low-density runs. Even in the 20s, railroads were looking for ways to cut costs on branch line passenger travel, which resulted in motor cars such as this gas-powered one. The motor cars could even handle an extra car or two if needed. The idea of self-contained electric propulsion had an early payoff with the introduction of diesel switchers that became popular even before World War II. The lower fuel expense and the reduced labor to use them killed off the orders for steam switchers first. As the diesel developed, it became ready for the heavy work. The mainline freight diesel was revolutionized by General Motors-owned Electromotive Division with the 1939 FT model. The FT and later F models brought standardization to diesel building. This made maintenance easier and would make run-through and pool power arrangements between neighboring railroads a practical strategy by the 60s. Several other diesel makers, such as Alco and Baldwin, struggled out of their dying steam locomotive market with their own diesel offerings. Baldwin never did make a standardized line, choosing to build custom locomotives until their end in the mid-50s. Alco had some early post-war success building the cab and road switcher models shown here in Great Northern colors. The conservative Northern Pacific also bought a few Alcos, but it looked much more like an all-EMD railroad. Alco's locomotives had many problems with their diesel power plant in the first critical 5 years when railroads were converting to diesels as quickly as possible. The race to win orders and introduce new models may have been the cause of shortened development and testing cycles. Alco also was an early user of turbocharging on top of the normal supercharging. Their horsepower advantage became a liability with increased engine failures. In boosting power output, the extra stress of turbocharging caused many part failures. EMD became the big supplier for F units for both freight and passenger use, and passenger E units for all the hill lines from the start. The colors on these GN diesels are Omaha orange and Pullman green. By far, the sparsely painted silver E units of the Burlington lines defined graceful speed. The EMD's SD9 and especially the GP9 became the final answer to ending steam with reliable and economical power that anchored the railroad industry until larger power finally replaced them on mainline assignments in the 60s. The Jeep 7 and similar Jeep 9 models were more versatile than the F units for freight assignments. They could work like road locomotives and still perform like switchers when necessary. Their boxy looks would eventually phase out the streamlined cab unit orders, with Jeep 9 orders continuing to 1958, when steam on the Northern Pacific finally ended. The NP alone owned almost 200 cab or F units by the time the last F9 models were ordered in 1956. The Northern Pacific cab units wore several paint schemes, and they handled freight, mail, and passenger trains. The Northern Pacific canoe-shaped paint scheme with the Orient-inspired monad symbol on this Jeep has several variations, but the overall concept lasted to the merger. The more modern General Electric U-25C's blunt nose look obscured the canoe theme, but it still looked very NP. The SP&S, owned by the GN and the NP, had a fondness for Alcos. They started with this black and gold scheme until they adopted a new one with a definite Great Northern influence. This NP Main Streeter had the pine tree color paint scheme. The NP slogan of Main Street of the Northwest was adopted after World War II. This slogan was on the sides of many of their diesels. The premier dome-equipped train, the North Coast Limited, inspired a new look with the Raymond Loewy designed light and dark green with a white central stripe. This striking color scheme spilled over to many of the passenger cars in the fleet. There was a period of several years where the color schemes seemed intermixed on all the trains. Here at Missoula, we'll watch a variety of trains run through the yard to see the NP of the late 50s. Much of the NP trackage through Montana has been abandoned, along with the electrified Milwaukee tracks that closely paralleled the Northern Pacific. In the BN merger, the Great Northern had the superior route through this area. From the dome of the North Coast Limited, the NP could sell scenery that rivaled the California Zephyrs, and the service and safety record of the train was superb. The NP carried the train through their territory from the coast east to St. Paul, where the power and tracks became the CB&Q all the way to Chicago. These scenes were taken in the mid-50s when dome cars seemed to give the passenger business a shot in the arm. The passenger rail business was no longer capable of attracting the business traveler. Now it depended on the vacationing traveler. The Chicago to Seattle or Portland traveler had 4 competing choices. The NP, the GN, and the Milwaukee Road, plus the Union Pacific had its city trains and dome travel behind E-units. The North Coast Limited is shown here in Chicago with an appearance of rival GN's Empire Builder in Omaha orange and Pullman green. As the 60s came, these two trains were combined east of St. Paul into Chicago. From Chicago's Union Station, Empire Builder or North Coast Limited passengers could go from the second largest to the largest U.S. city of 1960 in just 16 more hours by the New York Central's water level route, making a full coast-to-coast trip. The CB&Q was the funnel for all this traffic, including the California Zephyrs and its twin city Zephyrs that often had NP or GN cars tacked on for forwarding at St. Paul to other trains. The CB&Q adopted the red, white, and gray colors in 1959, giving them a modernized look. The 60s brought Jeep 20 and 30 models with higher horsepower and even larger diesels from General Electric. By 1967, the Great Northern changed over to big sky blue with white accents. This experiment in corporate identity was short-lived. In 3 years, the N color would become Cascade Green of the new Burlington Northern. The 1970 Burlington Northern merger was sad for fans of the individual roads, but it was spectacular to see the rainbow of power scattered all over the new system. We'll watch a parade of early merger activity while we review the long overdue merger. The merger of 1970 was really from a vision of James Hill that could be traced back as early as 1893, when the proposed Northern Pacific and Great Northern merger was denied by the government. The attempted merger in 1901 included the newly acquired CB&Q, but it was foiled by a political climate that saw everything as a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's interesting that James Hill could own all 3 lines, he just couldn't merge them. In glaring contrast, E.H. Harriman could not own both the UP and the SP, let alone merge them, by Supreme Court order. After his death, it was harder to defend his empire, and the government made an example of Harriman posthumously. A merger attempt under Ralph Budd in 1927 was approved for the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific to merge if they cut loose the CB&Q. That was not acceptable. The ICC was always concerned about the Milwaukee Road's future if the hill lines merged. The Milwaukee did nearly everything the combined hill lines did, but not as well. They connected Chicago, St. Paul, Omaha, Kansas City, and numerous secondary lines in Granger territories. In effect, they seemed similar in scope to the more successful CB&Q. They also had the so-called Pacific Extension that brought them Seattle and Spokane. This line followed the Great Northern and Northern Pacific westward all the way from St. Paul. If a BN merger knocked out the Milwaukee, there would be no second railroad for shippers to use between St. Paul and the Pacific Northwest. During the mid-50s, new consolidation studies were made until 1961 when the merger was reawakened. After 9 exhausting years, and even a denial that was appealed, it went through. This time, during the BN's 9-year wait, there were no objections from the Milwaukee, since they were attempting to merge with the Chicago and Northwestern by 1964. A Milwaukee merger with the Rock Island was also much discussed. In fact, the idea of a Chicago Northwestern, Rock, and Milwaukee merger would have created a super Midwest system. One concession the Milwaukee received from the 1970 BN merger was trackage rights down to Portland, Oregon on BN tracks. This pair of ex-Northern Pacific Jeep 9s are a temporary guest on Milwaukee tracks, probably due to a flood on Northern Pacific tracks. This type of cooperation is something that rival railroads have always worked out in their own mutual interest as an industry. The Milwaukee still operated a mixture of diesel power with electric helpers in their rugged section of Montana into Idaho. 4 years after the BN merger, the electric operation would end, beginning Milwaukee's spiral into oblivion. The Milwaukee had some hope that they could become a part of the BN, but BN already had everything they needed, and more. BN's merger was the first Western merger of any significant size. The Great Northern and Northern Pacific route miles paralleled each other. Unlike the Eastern roads, there was not the heavy concentration of industrial manufacturing in places along the way from St. Paul to Spokane. Their business was to long-haul goods from connections with the CB&Q and its sources of industrial and agricultural traffic. The GN, NP, and CB&Q made good partners. The fourth merger road was the smaller SP&S. It dated from the turn of the century and was built and jointly owned by the NP and the GN. It interconnected the 3 cities in its name and its 2 parents together for more efficient traffic flow. It was designed to help both parent roads compete better with the old Union Pacific and the SP Harriman interests. The SP&S Alco fleet was folded into the BN system, and locomotive shortages gave them a reprieve from the scrapper's torch. The F-unit fleet was retained too. A system of this sudden size couldn't deal with huge new locomotive orders to completely eliminate older power. Other expenses would come first. By 1964, the Rock Island was also involved with a merger into the UP system, so the UP could finally get its own tracks from Omaha into Chicago. The UP-Rock merger was finally approved in 1974, but the Rock Island had slid into a disastrous condition by then, and the UP backed away. This collection of locomotives represents the size of BN's problem of renumbering and eventually repainting nearly 2,000 total locomotives from the big merger. The pair of red CB&Q Jeep 35s were already 7 years old when the merger hit. Their red, white, and gray paint started in 1959, but it would now eventually become green like all the rest. A new coat of green didn't guarantee a unit to stay around for long, however. Some older power was painted and parked in storage when the economy declined in the early 70s. The units not painted green simply had the number repainted. The Alco fleet was a problem. The Northern Pacific had a few left from purchases in the early 50s, and they would hang on for a little while longer. The SP&S continued buying Alcos up to a late date of 1968 when they bought 10 Alco Centuries, just before Alco itself left the U.S. locomotive market. Somehow, with this mixed bag of old, new, and somewhat bizarre power, the BN put one unified railroad together in the middle of a turned-down economy. The economy issue may have actually helped somewhat. If business had suddenly boomed, they may have been caught flat-footed with too little in the way of reliable power. Over the years, the Alcos dropped away, along with the F-unit fleet. The Alcos were all gone by 1980. This Alco C424 was built in 1964. The last unit is an Alco Century C636, a 1968 monster with 3,600 horsepower. The striking red CB&Q units showed up in places rarely seen before, giving new meaning to their old slogan, "Everywhere West." The new numbering placed a small BN under the number visible on this 3,000 horsepower Jeep 40 and the Northern Pacific U33C built by General Electric that produced 3,300 horsepower. The fresh new green, black, and white look grew as the new BN took hold, giving old rivals in the West something to worry about, a coordinated railroad that proved you could forge 4 different personalities into one that could capture the confidence of shippers. The Southern Pacific connected into Portland, taking business to the south and then east, and they would begin to worry more. Even in the Great Northern days, the SP was the target, and the Great Northern gained tracks down to Klamath Falls, Oregon to eventually build the Inside Gateway with the Western Pacific. This line allowed the Great Northern and the WP and the Santa Fe at Stockton, California to reach lucrative Southern California markets, with the wealth of the Northwest breaking the SP's total dominance over this type of traffic. These 1971-built SD45s are fresh new units, and the WP unit on the point is a fresh new U30B. They will run their train down to Stockton, California, where the train will be handed over to the Santa Fe. This basic operation started in the Depression of the 30s, and the diesel age brought the concept of mixing power in a rotating pool power arrangement between the BN and the WP. The BN crew will be changed out for a WP crew at Bieber, California. Here's another pool power group with a mix of 2-cycle EMDs and a WP U-boat. The yellow unit is an Alco Century from the SP&S. Listen to the difference between the WP's GE engine and the Alco Century, both 4-cycle engines. A A brief look at NP's tracks on the Puget Sound will bring a trackage rights UP grain train followed by a BN local. Although they competed, they still had agreements that reached back to settlements between James Hill and E.H. Harriman just after the turn of the century. More pool power and run-through agreements involve the Rio Grande and the old CB&Q dating from 1965 that could link trains into the Western Pacific, bringing more flexibility. The inside gateway would see increased traffic with the ambitious new BN and an aggressive Western Pacific. We'll look at this interesting operation in more detail. The Inside Gateway opened in 1931. It was conceived by Great Northern's Arthur James to create a basis of north-south traffic. The Great Northern worked with the Western Pacific and Santa Fe to take some business away from the Southern Pacific. The Great Northern built the line south from Klamath Falls, Oregon to meet the Western Pacific at Bieber, California, literally in the middle of nowhere. The Western Pacific tracks ran from Bieber on what they called their High Line to WP's main line at Keddie, California. Trains ran down to Stockton, California on the WP to meet the Santa Fe, who took blocks of freight south through the Central Valley and the Tehachapis into Los Angeles. Some of this traffic could run as far as Vancouver, Canada, down to San Diego, California on Great Northern, WP, and Santa Fe rails. The Gateway was a great place to see WP and BN trains with colorful pool power lash-ups in the 70s. It was also a haven for old Alcos, still left on the BN roster. The Gateway had an upsurge of traffic during World War II. After the war, the Great Northern had to develop peacetime traffic sources. The BN merger of 1970 brought new pool power agreements for power and cabooses between BN and the WP. Much of this was the work of WP's Al Pearlman, who revitalized the WP during the 70s. The freight cars in this and other Gateway trains show a mixture of Santa Fe and former Hill Lines marked cars. Many of the NP, GN, SP&S, and CB&Q cars would roll on into the late 80s before being repainted into BN green. This part of the line generated almost nothing in traffic of its own, the curse of a latecomer to an area. By comparison, the parallel SP line from Klamath Falls down to the Sacramento Valley tapped into one of the most productive agricultural areas out west. The pool power agreement between the WP and the BN helped even out operation costs automatically. The easier topology of the GN-built half compared to the heavier grades and sharper curves on the WP's half would have otherwise made an imbalance of operation costs. The line was built with fewer and shorter sidings, some as short as 2,500 feet. This and the lack of signaling plus lighter rail on the WP's half created disadvantages. Nevertheless, the operation was competitive at times by focusing on the concept of time freight linkage between the Pacific Northwest and Santa Fe connections. All parties were eager to compete with the UP and the SP that cooperated on north-south traffic. The famous bridge at Keddie Y was where the WP's High Line met the WP's east-west main line. The other leg of the bridge takes trains to the east with connections to the SP and the Rio Grande at the Great Salt Lake in Utah. will see many of these Alcos on gateway trains running out their years in this isolated duty. They were capable of good performance with the Alco-friendly shops of the former SP&S, but WP road crews didn't care much for the quirky units. This is the other side of Ketty, where you can see the tunnel that completes the Y and the small WP yard. This SP train is a flood reroute train taking flimsy orders at Greenville. The clouds in the sky are from a storm that washed out SP's paralleling Shasta line. Four and six-axle Alco Centuries with a trailing Jeep 30 from the CB&Q, all with fresh BN paint. Every once in a while, the Alcos were the point locomotive. Most crews preferred the comfort of the EMD's cabs, however. After repainting the BN's locomotives, the freight cars of the separate lines took much longer. The GN, NP, and CB&Q boxcars and others would show up for decades to come, although fewer each year. At the 1970 merger, the BN had 116,000 freight cars to eventually repaint green. Much of the credit for BN's smooth merger goes to Louis Mink, who was BN's first president. Mink was a former Frisco, CB&Q, and Northern Pacific president. He was also responsible for developing BN's huge coal hauling business by 1980, a large part of BN's modern success. Scenes like this were soon to vanish. The Alcos were eventually retired in the early 80s, and even the caboose fleet would have a standard green theme everywhere on the system. The haven for the old look out west on the gateway was changing too. During the 70s, a gateway train such as number 137 could bring 60-hour schedules between Seattle and Los Angeles. Vancouver, Washington to Stockton on train 139 had a 44-hour schedule to offer shippers. By 1980, the Union Pacific began showing its intentions on the Western Pacific's property, with the takeover by 1982. The UP finally gained tracks into Chicago when it merged with the Missouri Pacific and a line into the Oakland Bay area through the Sierras with the WP takeover. Traffic had already been declining on the inside gateway, but the UP takeover of the WP resulted in BN's canceling pool power arrangements. The rail industry was evolving rapidly during the 70s and 80s. The freight cars were larger, roof walks were being removed from cars for safety, automobile traffic had been recovered from truck carriers, and trains had to maintain schedules to compete with highways. The gateway traffic fell to almost nothing for several decades as a partial result of the WP-UP merger. The eventual Burlington Northern and Santa Fe merger of the 90s would give the line renewed purpose, but that's modern history. New labor agreements to reduce crew sizes and the elimination of many labor skills would be needed to modernize the industry. A case in point is this Union Pacific freight where UP and BN tracks blend near Tacoma, Washington, circa 1978. The control of trains back then used paper orders snatched from train order stands. The slowing of trains to accomplish this and the extra labor to staff countless locations created a real dollar and time drag on the industry. This BN train with 50s vintage power was still clinging to life. It would soon disappear along with the train order stands. The F-unit fleet served the BN until newer power could replace them all by the early 80s. By then, instead of helper power consisting of 4-unit sets of F units, the more likely site would be a pair of 3,600 horsepower turbocharged SD45s or F45s. Some of the 50s built power would hang on for much longer, such as the Jeep 7 and 9 power finding work on locals and switching industries until the 90s. The mainline power of the 50s would be the switch engines of the last quarter century. The BN was taking on a modern and standardized look with newer EMD power such as SD45s and the newer built SD40-2 models that essentially standardized the entire mainline railroad industry. BN entered the 80s unified, modernized, and prepared to take on any rivals in their territory, even the equally powerful age-old rival, the Union Pacific. Let's return to Chicago for one last chapter on the 1970 BN merger. Even quicker than the erasing of the CB&Q was the brief period of BN's experience with inner-city passenger trains. Due to the forming of Amtrak, the 1971 BN had only their commuter train business out of Chicago. The sleek silver E units of the Q were repainted in Cascade green with various styles of nose stripes for safety. 25 E units were rebuilt at the Morrison Knutson shop in Boise, Idaho, and a pair of 645s replaced the old 567 series diesels. A small Cummins diesel generator with roof-mounted mufflers was added for HEP electrical heating to replace the old-fashioned steam heating. These dual 645 motored E's could handle a long cut of Budd Corporation-built double-deck commuter cars and keep a fast schedule on the Chicago to Aurora racetrack. The commuter service into Chicago from the various outlying areas was provided by the CB&Q, Chicago and Northwestern, Rock Island, Norfolk and Western, the Milwaukee Road, and several others in the years before Metra. Even the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio had a commuter train using chicken wire F3s and heavyweight passenger cars. After World War II, the Santa Fe and the CB&Q's Ralph Budd tried to purchase the 150-mile-long Mexico, Missouri to Kansas City tracks from the GM&O. This was to improve Santa Fe and the Q's service. The GM&O would have retained trackage rights over the upgraded line. The ICC rejected the plan based on objections voiced by Frisco, Mopac, Rock Island, and others in the region. The GM&O itself would be part of the competing Illinois Central by 1972. Much of the GM&O would eventually be eliminated and sold off by the new ICG system by the 80s. By 1988, the ICG reverted back to being just the IC. A short 1978 visit at Joliet and the crossing brings another complex story of the ever-changing rail scene. This endless BN coal train is powered by a pair of U-33Cs built in 1972. They have seen a rapid buildup of BN's coal business. In fact, BN would soon be the biggest coal hauler in the U.S. This loaded train is on GM&O track, and it will be passed by an Illinois Central TOFC train. The coal drag was also passed by an Amtrak train which had time to stop, deal with passengers and baggage, and resume its run. All the while, the coal cars kept rolling by. This is what railroads are very good at, unit trains that handle land-based tonnage of bulk commodities more efficiently than any other form of transportation. Rock Island tracks crossed here, and this 1978 scene has a remaining 2-year countdown to the Rock's March 31, 1980 total demise. After all the attempted merger deals, the Rock had allowed itself to deteriorate past repair, waiting for the rescue that would not come. A 7,000-mile railroad expiring like that was a shock to the industry. The Santa Fe would also have a rough time during the 80s with a merger with the SP that was denied by the ICC. Taking the already intertwined SP-SF pair by surprise, the merger was split back into 2 weakened railroads. Fortunately, the Santa Fe built itself back up to health. It would have an easier time merging with the Burlington Northern to form the 1995 BNSF system. Now, this former Santa Fe used line from 1888 is a BNSF line, seeing as many as 50 trains a day. The original CB&Q already owned large blocks of Frisco stock by 1966. The Frisco was brought into the original BN system by 1980 from plans that started in 1977. The St. Louis-San Francisco Railway can trace its history back to 1853. Between the Civil War and later actions of Jay Gould, their plan to fulfill the ambitious San Francisco part in their name was stopped. With the merger of 1980, BN gained 4,600 more miles of track extending into Oklahoma, Texas, and reaching Birmingham, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida. Before the final 1995 merger with the Santa Fe, the BN had expanded to nearly 29,000 miles of track. As we close out this story of the original BN merger, we'll look at some new BNSF scenes from 2001. The paint shops are busy again and will be for some time to come. Today's BNSF still puts on an impressive show with trains of unimaginable size and frequency. Solid trains of bulk commodities of 100-plus cars are the norm. Wood products, grain, coal, iron ore, and intermodal trains seem to dominate, but the basic manifest freight is still a welcome sight with reporting marks of fallen roads still visible to the viewer. In some ways, it's like 1970 again, with colorful mixes of power and new trackage rights and pool power arrangements that bring endless variety. Sometimes you can still be astonished by what will run by. The stack train business brings us back to James Hill's vision of trading with the East. Containers from ships that came from Japan, Korea, and China fulfill that dream, and ironically it takes business away from a Panama Canal that is no longer U.S. owned. Our cameras will take you to Fort Collins, Colorado on former CB&Q owned Colorado and Southern tracks for some great street running. The flavor of the old lines still runs deep in many locations on the modern BNSF. This type of operation is becoming rare. The second street runner has cars still marked for the old Northern Pacific and Great Northern. Skipped over in the BN painting, they may linger into the BNSF era for a while longer. Many railroads have fewer cars today than 10 or 20 years ago. The modern answer has been to rely on leased cars and shipper-owned cars. The BNSF will gradually erase the old familiar BN of 1970. So far, they have smoothly transitioned into the super railroad of all times.